Hello and welcome everybody. Welcome back to Comedian MTG. My name is Ian. We are here on a bit of a crazy week. I am in the middle of the process of moving to my new apartment, but we are here to break down the Mox Masters tournament for February of 2024. We have our top 16 here today. We're going to go through those top 16 lists, give them a little bit of analysis, and talk about some of the crazy stuff we see here in this tournament. While you're here on YouTube, make sure to hit those like buttons and those subscribe buttons. They help out the channel a ton. And if you're feeling extra generous, check out patreon.com/comedianmtg. All the help over at Patreon is so huge. We're hoping to have a full new tier rolled out by the end of March, or by the start of March, pardon me, by the end of February. And hopefully that can help to boost the channel a little bit there too. Without any further ado, I say let's jump into these decks. First up, we have Kinnan Dustbunder by Hungry Guitar Student. We have a pretty standard Kinnan list here. This one seems very close to the one that is Wounded Satellite's primer over on the database. And actually, this has scratched my curiosity. So I'm going to see how many innovations there are in this list. Yeah, so this list is literally 2 cards different than the primer list of Wounded Satellites over there on the database. The main difference between Grind Them into Dust is on Chain of Vapor, whereas this variant is on Resculpt. So pretty similar to the classic Kinnan list that we are pretty much used to at a lot of these tournaments. The idea for Kinnan, for those who aren't aware, is that Kinnan is a mana doubler. So either A, you're flipping into a number of very scary creatures here, or B, you're trying to combo off specifically with Basalt Monolith, which with Kinnan is able to generate infinite colorless mana, which can be filtered by cards like Mirage Mirror, Gracios, and a number of different outlets in this deck. Apart from that, you're looking to sort of control the board by using a combination of blue interaction and big creatures to lock things down. We have the Beep Beep by Wounded Satellite, the person we just mentioned about the Kinnan primer. This is a Rogsai variant by Wounded Satellite, who is not really known for playing Rogsai, but I believe this has been something he's been picking up for fun as of late. And when we were talking about him playing this deck, he said he was kind of going through his I like playing ad nauseam arc. If you remember, he's been sort of on a Obnixilis kick as of late, and this is sort of just another addition to the ad nause pile that he's sort of been going for. It's a pretty standard Rogsai list. The idea is that you are on this classic 24 land, very, very low to the ground Rog list, with Rogrek being able to enable a number of your very cheap things that allow your commander to basically be something like a Mox in the command zone, using things like Paradise Mantle and Mox Amber to enable basically the fastest wins in the format. You're trying to do ad nauseum stuff, trying to do Underworld Breach things, and of course you always have the classic backup plan of going Thassa's Oracle, plus either Demonic Consultation or Tainted Pact. It's pretty classic Rogsai stuff. Congrats to Wounded on the top 16 with this list. We have Good Pile cEDH here by Willy Hilly. This is a pilot who I'm actually pretty familiar with because we have done some coaching. We actually did a lot of work on their version of Teveshkrom, but here we have straight up Timnakrom. This is the classic blue farm list that we've grown to know in the format. The new innovation here that we've seen from a couple pilots is Brina the Demagogue. Basically, Brina becomes a very board controlling version of Timna that sort of just adds to the Timna plan you're already kind of trying to do with Blue Farm, trying to use these and a number of other of these pieces to gain a bunch of advantage using Timna and Crom, mostly for card advantage, and then eventually win with a number of different ways. Usually mostly relying upon ad nauseum, but also being able to use things like Thassa's Oracle lines we've already spoken about. Blue Farm is the most consistent performing deck in the format right now, and it will continue to do so. Good to see another pilot here making the top cut. We have These Warriors Don't Blow 3v1 Leads by Splocketeer. This is Najeela, Blade Blossom, pretty classic Najeela stuff here. This is the variant of Najeela that we have come to know in the format right about now. It's a pretty classic Najeela list using a hybrid game plan of either A, going for ad nause strategies, much like we saw with some of these other lists, usually ending in things like Underworld Breach. Intuition Pile is able to do that quite as well, but also having a bunch of Najeela combos baked into the deck as well. This one actually having Derevi as a Najeela combo, but not Grim Hireling, which we're kind of used to seeing from a lot of these Turbo Najeela lists. And if we go down here, now there's no Druid's Repository, no Nature's Will in general either. So this really is a very Derevi focused version of Najeela without another backup Najeela win, which kind of crazy seeing is how easy a lot of those backup Najeela wins are to execute. So it's usually a little strange to only see a single Najeela outlet here in Derevi, but we have our Breach plan, we have our Adnaz plan in the deck as well. So clearly our pilot here just leaning into those options a little more so. Najeela is a pretty classic 5-color option here. The interesting card here to see is Agatha's Soul Cauldron, basically converting any of these colorless mana outlets into activations of Najeela. So that part's pretty interesting. I guess it also works with, using things like Dark Ritual as well. So congrats to our pilot on taking Najeela to the top cut. We have the Chad bot here with Back Alley Dealer. This is a Tivit list. And a Tivit list with a decent top end for this deck for sure. One of the most interesting choices here in this deck is the fact that this is a Tivit list playing 3 mana Teferi, but not playing Displacer Kitten, which has historically been sort of an auto include in any Tivit list. Kitten not only is a combo with Teferi, which is one of the main reasons I'm very surprised to see one and not the other here, but also just works insanely well with Tivit. I mean, it's the ability to flicker Tivit repeatedly is usually one that will win the game after a few non-creature spells. So definitely quite surprised to not see that in this version. We're seeing the Hullbreaker Horror tech, which is starting to become a little more standard in Tivit. This one's also running Urza in that 4-drop stop over Displacer Kitten, which is pretty fascinating. We have another double board wipe Tivit, which is also becoming pretty standard at this point, and a few more controlling pieces along the way. Tivit's definitely our classic Esper control list, either winning with the Time Sieve combo, which is a 1-card combo as long as there are still 4 players in the game. And Tivit's doing the thing. Also can win with Thoracle Lines or with the Hullbreaker that we mentioned earlier. But yeah, definitely a surprise to not see Displacer among the ranks of win conditions in this list. And curious to hear if the pilot has any reason for that innovation particularly. I'm love to hear in the comments below if anyone knows a little bit more about that. We have Timnacrom Midrange Ad Nauseam by Mint. This is another Timnacrom list like we talked about earlier in this episode, but this one is also running a few more creatures. This one's on the 3-mana Teferi as well, on Lotho, which I don't think we saw in our earlier version, and Dauntless Dismantler to disrupt our opponents when they are trying to win with their own docksides and things of that nature. It's an ad nauseam version of this deck, very low on artifacts, on Mox Amber and Mox Opal, which are kind of some unconventional choices for artifacts in this deck, but also straight up a Mox Opal deck with 13 standard artifacts and 1 more from Esper Sentinel, and I guess technically Phyrexian Metamorph as well, although that does not often come quite early. And then the treasures from Ragavan and Dockside to really supplement that. So I feel like this deck just never had Mox Opal online, if I'm being honest. But I guess it might just be a card that's better post ad nauseam. Apart from that, it's a pretty standard blue farm list. We're starting to see Necropotence and Smothering Tithe, which used to be sort of hot tech in blue farm, become more and more apparent as staples in this deck moving forward. So we have another blue farm list here. Congrats, Mint. We have Mox Masters 10/2/2024 by Tuca. I believe this is the European way of saying it, so 2/10/2024. But this is Tuca's Tayam list. Tuca, known for being one of the Tayam brothers, as they're called. 2 pilots very, very, very well known for playing this deck. We actually have a deck tech on this very channel by Pixel, the other of the Tayam brothers, which you can check somewhere here in these magical links. But this is pretty classic Tayam. It's interesting to see Tayam because it's been pretty off of the face of the earth since the Bowmasters meta really started to take over. And, it was suffering for quite some time, but here we have it making 10th place in this tournament here. For those who don't know, Tayam is an extremely interwoven and complicated combo deck, basically involving you wanting to activate your commander a bunch. The way to stop Tayam is to not let the commander activate a bunch and not let them get counters on their creatures. And if you do, you're probably in a world of hurt. So yeah, Tayam definitely gonna do some interesting stuff here. Brina the Demagogue was not in any versions that we saw beforehand. Eternal Witness definitely was. Dosin the Falling Leaf, definitely not a card I associate with Tayam at all. So that's pretty fascinating to see that here in this version of the deck. And Bartolome de Presidio, another one, really interesting that it's a sack outlet, which the deck already really likes, and it adds 1/1 counters, which the deck very much likes. So some interesting new tech here from the Lost Caverns of Ixalan. We also have from the Lord of the Rings set Legolas's Quick Reflexes, which is a very good pickup for this deck, and the brand new Arc Druid's Charm from Ravnica from our Murders at Karlov Manor set. This card, I think, is going to continue to see more and more play in all the green decks in our format. It's very flexible, very strong, and I have a feeling as long as Gaia's Cradle's around, we're going to be seeing Arc Druid's Charm for sure. We have Treasures for Kids by Drossfry. This is a super interesting Magda list. Magda, the Brazen Outlaw, has been a staple of being in and out of the format so frequently in cEDH, and this version is pretty unique. There's definitely some interesting tech here. Luca specifically is one that I'm quite fascinated by, and I'm kind of wondering what the utility is here. I know if you do the minus ability, exiling one of your 2 drops, you can flip into a number of these 3 drops that all give you a decent amount of value, but it feels like that's not quite the reason why it's in this list, especially because if you were trying to truly abuse this card, you'd have like one large top end threat that this could flip into. And then the Cavern Horde Dragon is definitely one that obviously you want to be pulling off of Magda and stuff like that to be getting a ton of treasures, but definitely interesting to see this card here, and fascinated to hear if the pilot of this Magda list would like to enlighten us on the Luca inclusion in this deck. I would definitely be super curious to hear, because as I mentioned, Luca's minus ability adds mana value. So I'm wondering if maybe like the 3 drops are supposed to go upwards to Roaming Throne or Cavern Horde Dragon. I've also heard from a lot of Magda pilots that Roaming Throne really changed the game for this deck, and been one of the best pickups by a really significant amount, which does not surprise me. This card is very, very powerful. And, not only does it double the ability of Magda when it attacks, but also the activated sack 5 treasure ability. So I can easily see the combination of Roaming Throne and Magda getting out of hand insanely fast. There are so many innovations when it comes to Magda. I know it is one of those decks that people love to work on in very intense and focused ways. So if there's anything that a bunch of Magda pilots want to point out as particularly unusual inclusions in this list, feel free to throw those in the comments down below. But Magda is a deck that's, obviously putting good reps on mono red. One of my favorite ways to play Magic is mono red, and love to see it doing well in these tournaments. This is L'Appel du Vide by Wiley, also known as the Call of the Void, and very interesting term if people want to look that up. I just did that between deck techs here. This is a Kinnan mid-range deck here. It's got some different choices here and some interesting tech for Kinnan that I'm definitely excited to talk about. We've got some, pretty standard cards with a lot of our mana dorks here and some pieces like Thrasios and stuff like that. But some definitely interesting top end. We have things like Teferi Mage of Resolve here, which is basically a flash Grand Abolisher type effect that you can flash into end step, and that works pretty well with the Kinnan plan. The only downside being that you cannot hit this card off of a Kinnan activation. We have the new Clever Impersonator, and by new, I mean this card's been around since cons, but it is new tech in the format. A lot of people are using it to just copy people's Rhystic Studies or One Rings or Smothering Tithes and be able to use them in Kinnan as much as they can use them in other decks. Roaming Throne here, pretty fascinating. I'm not really sure what you're naming here with Roaming Throne in the deck. We have our pilot out there. Very curious to hear how the Roaming Throne works with this deck. I'm not seeing any particularly insane synergies, but I'd be curious to hear about it. I believe Kinnan's effect is a replacement effect, I thought, but I guess whenever you tap an island permanent for mana, add 1 mana of that type to the permanent produced. So I guess it is a replacement mana ability. I know there's been some discussion around how that works, and I guess also the double activated abilities too. No, it's only triggered abilities, so it doesn't double the activated abilities of Kinnan. So does it add more mana with Kinnan? I don't know that for sure. I definitely will have to call the judges out there to comment on that one in particular. Interesting stuff here. Definitely some cards that you don't see in the standard Kinnan builds. Last March of the Ants, another one, which is pretty sick because a lot of the times it's an uncounterable way. I know you probably can't read it in this version, but an uncountable way to dump a bunch of creatures onto the battlefield with Kinnan. I will say this feels like a lighter creature package for Kinnan. At 30 creatures is pretty low, especially when one of them is a 0/0 that can't even hit the battlefield. And yeah, it's been pretty interesting. Also some definitely interesting mana dorks here, things like Paradise Druid, which is not often used, and Sylvan Caryatid and stuff like that. I wonder if this is maybe a freed from the real. Okay, yeah, this is a freed from the real version of the deck. I mentioned that specifically because when things tap for double mana, usually you are seeing Freed from the Real Penman's Aura stuff to be able to generate infinite blue and green mana and go off from there. I guess infinite blue mana, and then you can switch it over to infinite green. So that's why you see pieces like Scrap Gorger, Bloom Tender, Paradise Druid, and Sylvan Caryatid, and Sanctum Weaver when that is not a standard choice with Kinnan. But I can definitely say, like, as things move towards more of a Bowmaster centered meta, having these sort of hex-proof mana producers is not the worst thing in the world, especially given the fact that a lot of boards and a lot of Kinnan's going to get some hate going through the format. So having these atypical pieces, the only downside really I see with these is that they're really hard to tutor for, right? You basically get drifts of phantasms, and that's like the only way to tutor for them in these colors. So pretty interesting stuff. Some cool innovations here with Kinnan, and it's always good to see one of the top decks of the format get a little bit of a rebrand here. some interesting tech. Also, we have things like Conqueror's Will, which is pretty sick here, and Agatha's Soul Cauldron. One card that gets a lot of judge questions is Relic of Legends with Kinnan. Specifically because you can tap the relic to add 1 mana, which will be doubled by Kinnan, but when you tap an untapped legendary with Relic's ability, that does not actually add more mana. So that's a fun little rules interaction that folks should know if they're using it here. Also, Viridian Revel, super spicy. Oh my god, I did not even realize this is a 20 land deck. I almost went through this entire deck without seeing that this is a 20 land Kinnan list. What? Multiple colorless lands. 1, 2, 3, 4 colorless lands in this 20 land Kinnan list is, I mean, we have a ton of artifacts. We have a ton of mana producers here. Not even playing like the normal 1 mana dorks that are often played in Kinnan. Wow, that's crazy to see so few here in this deck. I'm also kind of fascinated to see Walking Ballista in here. I feel like this is one of those cards that many people agreed early on in Kinnan that you really don't need in the deck, and the card quality isn't that high. So yeah, there's definitely some fascinating stuff here in this list, and yeah, some of it I don't even know how to react to. This is a crazy Kinnan list. I cannot believe you are playing 8 mana sorcery last March of the Ents in a 20 land deck. Yeah, this is crazy. This is so far the biggest jaw dropper of the tournament so far. For sure. Well, congrats to our pilot for whipping out the spice here with this deck, and yeah, sweet stuff. Strike First Strike card, No Mercy by Nova_Commander, duplicated from Joey Zero. By Nova Commander, duplicated by Joey Zero. So who actually topped here? Okay, so this is Joe Zero. Okay. So this is Joe Zero, apparently with a duplicated copy of this Najeela list. We have a 5-color Najeela list here. This seems to be right on the money as far as like standard 5-color Turbo Nas Najeela stuff. The differences between the ones that we saw earlier in this one's mainly being this one is on Druid's Repository as a backup Najeela line. This is also on Grim Hireling as that other backup 1-card combos with Najeela. So this list definitely 3 deep in the combos for Najeela as opposed to the one that we saw earlier in the tournament. This one is still, though, on these ad nauseum lines, on things like Culling Ritual, stuff like that, and going for breach lines as well. So definitely a bit of a different take on Najeela, but still in the same vein of we have hybrid ad nauseum style / 1-card combos Najeela. So congrats to Joe on taking this one down, and maybe name your deck something less confusing. We have Deadly Blade 7 here with Sase, Captain of Among Us. What a memey title. I love it. This is a 5-color Sase list. One of the lightest Planeswalker 5-color Sase lists I've seen in quite some time. I feel like we're usually looking at like a 7 Planeswalker package here in this deck, but apart from that, that's not that crazy. This is classic 5-color Sase stuff. We have the idea here that we will assemble a tutor line going through the ability to grab Aminatu, then Nicol Bolas, Dragon God, and then go down to Oath of Teferi, which will give you infinite Planeswalker activations and infinite blinks of any permanent on your board, usually which lets you win the game. You also have combos in the deck with Emil the Blessed and Dockside Extortionist. You can also combo with Bloom Tender, Vaporo Elder, and Selvala Heart of the Wilds through a series of pulling legends out of your deck to be able to make basically that combo that we talked about earlier, being the Planeswalker line with Aminatu, Nicol Bolas, and Oath of Teferi. This is one of the most consistent and high performing decks in the format. It's definitely one that is able to attack on an axis that traditional counterspells and interaction don't really deal with a lot. It's definitely one you need more targeted removal for to be able to handle, and a deck that's going to be able to take advantage of that sort of hole in the format when those things come up. I like seeing Smothering Tithe as a new adaptation for this deck. I feel like it really does help with some of these grindier games, and now that Mana Dorks are very easy pickings for Bowmasters and things like that, I think it's pretty solid in this list. Apart from that, not too many crazy spicy cards here that you don't see in pretty normal Sisse lists, and it's a pretty solid 5-color Sisse. Congrats to our pilot for taking it down. We have Yaksha here with Tutor, I hardly know her, Mockmaster February. This is another 5-color Sisse list. This one's throwing some different cards in here. So as opposed to the 5 Planeswalker package we looked at in the last list, this one's running Tihana, Gaedrome, and Ashiok. So Gaedrome's one we sort of talked about recently with Malcolm's deep run at the Boil. Gaedrome is very solid at being able to untap your creatures. It's also able to sort of control the board in some of those crazier games. And it's a Grixis legend, which is not always so easy to achieve in Sisse. We also have pretty standard creature package here with Siss. And this list is very similar to the one Malcolm most recently played. I'm like going down here to the artifacts to see if there's any Shorokais, which I'm not seeing. So it's not truly a copy of Malcolm's list from the Boil. But we have Flowering of the White Tree, definitely a solid Sisse card there that, some pilots are saying is pretty underplayed. Apart from that, this is another one of these Sisse lists with a few swaps around, but the same sort of general goal as the last one. We're trying to achieve the Planeswalker line that we talked about previously. Also, I forgot to say in the last version that we just have a Meal Dockside as a backup plan, and then being able to tutor any anything out of your deck with infinite treasures also helps too. Before we get into our top 4 here, I want to remind you that we do coaching here at Comedian MTG. If you would like to receive coaching from the player with more top cuts than any other player with different decks, you can check me out at Comedian MTG on Twitter, comedian_MTG over on Discord, or comedianmtg@gmail.com. Any of those places are great to reach out, and I can give you more info on coaching, prices, and availability. It's been a really amazing process so far. I've had a number of different clients make top 16s, top 4s, and even take tournaments down. So if you're interested in that process, please feel free to reach out to me at any of those places, all of which are pinned in the description below of this video. Thank you all for those who have jumped in so far, and for those who haven't, can't wait to see you. Back to the decks. We are here in the top 4 with Narset Enlightened Master by Jacob Wynn with Enlighten 1, Flip It or Rip It. This is the classic 6-mana Narset. So for those who don't know, I actually made a pretty deep run with a 6-mana Narset list pretty recently over at one of the Chaos tournaments, I believe it was. I actually don't remember which tournament it was at this point. Lotus Series? One of the good tournaments. One of the online tournaments. And we have another one here with Jacob Wynn's version of this deck, making it all the way to top 4. I did a sort of comparison page earlier today, and we're like 20 cards different with these lists, but a lot of like the sort of meat of the deck is the same. Its main differences being they run a few more lands that grant haste, like Hanwar Battlements and Flamekin Village and a couple of those, and also just like some different fetches and things like that. And then the other differences are like some of the interaction pieces, like I prefer things like Spell Snare, they're on Snapback and stuff like that. I also don't run Intuition and Sabine's Reclamation in my version of the deck, although I do run the Breach package. So just a few main differences between the lists, but the idea is definitely still the same. The idea being you attack with Narset as soon as possible. You try and get her out with haste with things like Generator Servant or Hellkite Courser, which is those might recognize from my recent Natali video, a card that is super sick in decks that are very commander-centric and want a commander-centric strategy. I do think this one is really interesting to me because unless you flip extra combats instead of extra turns, I feel like Hellkite Courser is considerably worse in Narset, but I guess maybe the idea is more so that you get so much advantage from that first iteration of Narset being pulled out of your command zone that maybe it's just kind of free value to play the Hellkite Courser in the deck. I'd be really curious to hear the thoughts of our pilot Jacob Wynn here with that part of the deck, because I think Hellkite Courser is really fascinating in these decks with very insanely powerful commanders, right? But it's a matter of wondering, like, what does this do specifically for Narset? Once again, especially given the fact that she has to go back to the command zone at the end of that turn, right? So even if you do hit extra turns, you don't have Narset for those extra turns. I also find this interesting that this version is playing Jace Wielder Mysteries. I didn't really have that in my version of the deck. I went through a lot of Blind Obedience lines to try and kill people on the same turn, but this deck also has that plus the Nexus of Fate for if you want to go for like infinite turns and things like that. So super interesting to see this Narset list here. I really didn't think many other people would be picking up the deck after I'd taken that run with it, but it's super cool. I love that this is a deck that is now shown up twice in the past few months. I think it's a really fun archetype to play. I did describe it as being hellish to play in specifically online tournaments, with the idea that if you're taking multiple turns in a row and your opponents are like sort of slow rolling their responses to stuff, they can easily like draw you out of time. So you really have to play extremely fast, and that is definitely one downside of the deck, is that you really don't get a lot of time to like take a pause, think about your plays, make sure you're doing the right stuff. It's just kind of like go for the extra turns, push through a lot of extra stuff, and then hope through 5 or 6 extra turns you can just end up winning the game. So Narset's a super sick deck. I can't believe it made it all the way to the top 4, but I'm so excited that it did. Congrats to our pilot for making a deep run with Narset. It's literally one of my favorite cards ever printed, and it's so cool to see it make this run. Speaking of surprises, we have Shaka here with Pod Sisse. Now, the Sisse decks that we've been talking about throughout this tournament are quite different than this Sisse that we see here today. This is what I can only describe as a very pod-based Sisse deck, right? But there's actually no birthing pod in it. So the name pod Sisse is more of like a homage to different like pod decks that exist previously. This is a very stacks heavy Sisse deck. We're running things like Archon of Emeria. We have Kunoros, Hound of Athreos, which is another very like stacksy legendary creature. We have, we are on Collector Roof in Sisse, which is traditionally a dockside deck, right? We have Drana and Linvala as like anti-creature combo hate. We have the classic Samut, Voice of Dissent in this version. Although, I know in the past there have been some Derevi combos with Samut and things like that, but usually those involve Najila in those versions of the deck. So I guess that's not what they're doing in this version because there is no Najila in the 3-drops unless I'm missing something. So this is a very fascinating Sisse list and definitely does not win through traditional Sisse means. And I'm not even really seeing like a hard win outlet here in this deck. I mean, there's a lot of like, once again, artifact hate and things like that, which is pretty interesting. I mean, Stony Silence, Collector Roof, no Null Rod, I think. Yeah, there's still an Agatha's Soul Cauldron and some of these other artifacts here. And also being a Null Rod deck that's on Smothering Tithe is a little bit contradictive to say the least, but kind of interesting here. A lot of these legends are very slow and clunky and definitely can grind out the game for sure. Fascinated to see this deck. I'm not really sure like what I'm looking for as far as win conditions here. I mean, there's always the classic like Emil plus Derevi plus Gaia's Cradle, right? Which works. There's also I don't know really what else. I guess like Emil plus Derevi plus any of the like Fabro and stuff like that. So I guess you still have those lines, right? Where you can tap your Bloom Tender, your Sovala, or your Fabro to generate infinite mana by flickering Derevi and over again. But I guess Derevi Emil stuff seems to be the most consistent hard outlet in the deck. And then, I guess you can win through a number of different ways with pulling random creatures out of your deck. And if you can get to a point where you can draw Bowmasters, obviously that's a pretty decent outlet for you. I wonder, is there Mount Doom in the mana base? Because that would also help clean things up. Yeah, so that's at least there. But this is a really fascinating Sisse list. The fact that once again it can win with Dockside Emil, but I actually don't know how this Sisse list wins the game if Emil gets exiled from this deck, which is not the craziest thing in the entire world, right? I guess the answer might just be hard beatdown, which is pretty fascinating. This is a rule of law Sisse with some stacks to your pieces, and but is also playing Fast as Oracle 2 and Demonic Consultation in Tainted Pact in a Rule of Law deck, which would not be something I would have put a bet on before seeing this deck list. So there's a lot of crazy stuff in here. And I would love to hear if the pilot of this deck has any sort of insight on some of these innovations. I'd be really fascinated to hear some of it, because a lot of these pieces seem almost contradictive to themselves, but they were good enough to make the top 4 of this tournament. So congrats on taking a rather peculiar Sisse list and doing really well with it. We have now the second biggest surprise of this tournament. Actually, this might be the biggest surprise of this tournament for me personally. In second place, we have Omnath Locust of All, the 5-color Omnath deck in the year of our Lord 2024. Your honor, all hail Spaghetti Monster, Moxmasters 24. By, do you want to say who's the pilot? By Logan, which they're surprised they did not put a name on here like the rest of them tend to. This is 5-color Omnath, which has, as far as my knowledge, seen 0 play at any cEDH tournament so far, and this deck is buck wild. So there's no infinite mana combos in the deck, and let's read this, because I'm confident in saying that I feel like many people don't actually know what this does. So it can be cast for 5 mana Wooburg, but the black mana is hybrid Phyrexian, so you can technically cast it for 4. If you would lose unspent mana, that mana becomes black instead. And at the beginning of your pre-combat main phase, look at the top card of your library. You may reveal that card if it has 3 or more colored mana symbols in its mana cost. If you do, add 3 mana in any combination of its colors and put it in your hand. If you don't reveal it, put it in your hand. So at the beginning of combat, worst case scenario, you get a draw that is not revealed but does not trigger draw effects, right? So that's not bad. You can just sort of get an extra draw for turn, right? Which in a 5-color deck, having a card draw engine's actually not that bad. And to be honest, I kind of forgot about that part of the text, so that does definitively make this card a little bit better. And then if you do trigger it, if you do reveal, you need 3 mana in any combination if a card has 3 or more colored mana symbols in its mana cost, right? So they don't have to be different colored mana symbols, which is a mistake I made when I first read this card. So for example, if you flip over Besiege the Mirror, that has 3 colored mana symbols of black, black, black. The Peer into the Abyss, black, black, black again. You're going to notice a theme here with a bunch of these having 3 colored mana symbols of a black, 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 like this Necropotence. And then I think that's it as far as things that have triple mana symbols in the deck. So that's kind of interesting. And then the rest of this list is like 5-color, I don't want to say turbo Nas, but I guess it's Nas heavy mid-range. This is a 10 artifact mana base also with a Mox Opal in it, which is staggering to me. There's an Esper Sentinel here, and I guess you have like treasures from like Lotho and Dockside, but I'm really quite surprised that Mox Opal is literally ever turned on, even after an Ad Nas. So that's kind of crazy. And then this is a like a very Nas focused mid-range deck, right? So the idea being like, okay, you know, I resolve a Calling Ritual, or I resolve any of these Dark Rituals and stuff like that, or the mana off of Omnath, and then I'm able to jam like a Peer into the Abyss or an Ad Nas and be able to draw the majority of my deck. Necropotence does some stuff too, and I assume there's Born Upon the Wind and Final Fortune, so the Necro lines also work. And I guess Omnath is really there just for advantage, which is pretty fascinating. And once again, like another thing with like the Born Upon the Wind lines off Necropotence is pretty crazy, given the fact that like you are on just 10 artifacts, right? So you really are in sort of like a strange Dockside or bust scenario. Yeah, this deck is pretty fascinating. And despite the commander being a pretty atypical choice, there's a lot of choices in here that I definitely would not have expected from a list like this. So it's pretty crazy stuff. I mean, there's like straight up a mana drain in a 5-color deck in here too, right? Like stuff like that. So definitely some stuff that's all over the place, but not like in a negative way. Just some super diverse choices here with this list. And yeah, at the end of the day, it is definitely a 5-color good stuff list, right? Also running for SWAT and Guardianship. So I guess I'm assuming part of the game plan is pretty consistently getting Omnath out as that, you know, once a turn card advantage engine. Wow, this is truly a strange and fascinating deck. And I would definitely love to hear if anyone has any insight on this one, because going through it, I feel like I'm just learning so much. And at the end of the day, right, like there's not like super crazy weird combos in here, right? At the end of the day, that's definitely like 5-color good stuff, just with some unique commanders and some different interaction and stuff like that. So sweet, yeah, congrats on taking this super spicy list and making second place with it in this major CEDH tournament. You know, I also think that description says a lot about the deck. Turbo mid-range at its finest. I think that really does say a lot. And the winner of our tournament, we have Freedom Waffle here, back on his Thrasios Dargo kick. Freedom was known for really cutting his teeth in cEDH off of this Thrasios Dargo list, and went to Blue Farm for quite some time, and now back on Thrasios Dargo. I'm a little sad because he had sort of hinted at the fact that he might play his old Marnius Calgar list at the tournament, but you know, he brought Thrasios Dargo and won the whole thing, so I guess I can't be too sad about it. Here is Thrasios Dargo midrange. For those who don't know, it's classic Thrasios infinite mana combos with things like Kinnan Bonder Prodigy and Basalt Monolith. You have Dockside combos with Timro Sabertooth and stuff like that. But then you get to some of the crazier combos, which are things like Displacer Kitten, Eternal Witness lines. You also have all of the Dargo synergy, right? So Dargo plus either Neoform or Eldritch Evolution gets you a Tidespout Tyrant, which then allows you to make infinite mana, pump that into Thrasios, draw your entire deck. You also get synergy with Dargo being stacked with things like Life's Legacy to draw a bunch of cards. You have things like Usually Greater Good. Yes, we do have it here in this version. Oh yeah, Birthing Pod also, sorry, another effect that can turn Dargo into a Tidespout Tyrant. So that part's pretty consistent with the game plan. And then you have some Breach lines, pretty classic Team Breach stuff. You got Brain Freeze, all that stuff. Yeah, Thrasios Dargo midrange, a deck that, you know, I tend to not really like a lot in this metagame, but through the hands of pilots like Manila and Freedom Waffle, able to consistently do well with these lists. So congrats to Freedom on the win here. Quick little PS here. We are still dealing with Drawgate in these online tournaments. Please, TOs, adjust your systems. make it a top 13 cut, make it a top 10 cut. Please make it something, because I am so saddened by all these players dejectedly coming to me and saying, yeah, I got 2 wins in this tournament, but because I didn't get them round 1 or round 2, I wasn't able to draw into the top 16, and everyone else was trying to draw in these tournaments. I think it's getting ridiculous to a point where the fact that nothing has changed is showing a certain apathy towards your players, and it's quite frustrating from someone who does this full time, because there have been a lot of solutions pitched. I think the easiest one is just changing to a top 13 cut, because you cannot just go 2 wins and then draw the rest of the day and guarantee you make a top 13 cut. It encourages players to actually play the game. So please do something about it. It's so frustrating to see that a lot of players are still frustrated by the same issue we've been dealing with. And hopefully this just changes soon. And I know there are other solutions, such as just adding more rounds to these tournaments. But if your intent is to have one-day cEDH tournaments, it's very easy to just change the amount of points needed. Top 13 cut, for anyone who doesn't know, is you just allow the person who ended the day in first place to skip right to the top 4. And then everyone else fights it out in the top 16, or more realistically, the top 12. So 3 pods, fight for those last 3 spots. That works as well. Top 14 works as well. Just top 16 specifically, with as many players that are showing up to these, is guaranteeing that players can just win early and draw the rest of the day. And it's just not creating fun environments for anybody. It is lame that players are sitting there showing up for 2 rounds and then disappearing for 2 hours, and then coming back and saying, hey, do we want to draw again? Disappearing for another 2 hours, and then not play Magic for like 5 hours. Like, it's like ridiculous that this is still something that's happening. So please fix this. There are solutions out there. They're easy solutions to implement, if I'm being honest, and we need to start making a change, because it's not good for the health of online tournaments. It's not good for the health of cEDH in general to have people frustrated by your space every single weekend. And it doesn't feel good when you're a new player who does really well in a tournament but just wins later. It sucks. It really does suck. And it feels like the odds are stacked against you, and it looks bad for our scene. So please make an adjustment. And that wraps up our tournament. I'm so excited to personally jump back into cEDH tournaments. Last weekend I was helping out at the regional championship in Denver for Modern, and this weekend I'm moving. The weekend after that is MagicCon Chicago, so a few weeks without a tournament, and it's definitely some of the weirdest times in my cEDH career for a while, but I'm so excited to jump back into cEDH tournaments, and so excited to be able to report on a number of these really cool innovations that we're seeing here in this tournament. Some crazy spicy decks in the top 4, like this stacks heavy Siss list. We have 6-mana Narset. I mean, obviously a huge W for any 6-mana Narset fans, and this 5-color Omnath deck, which gun to my head, would never have predicted that is what was going to be showing up in this tournament. So really cool stuff out of the cEDH tournament, and excited to see what our players surprise us with next. Thank you all so much for joining us here on this episode. We will catch you next time.